Well, it's a delight to see you. I know you're tired of my voice.
Not at all.
Yes, yes. Listen, before we start, we want to do two things. One, we want to say that we support free speech, and we support the free speech of students. Right? So let's just keep those students covered in your minds. And the second thing, which is so important, we just had some great news. Dr. Edda feels black. And this wonderful text is now the recipient of the Lincoln Prize.
Yes. Beautiful.
Thank you.
Beautiful.
That's a monumental achievement. Her life is about to really, really change. So I want to open up with a question, and I'll start with you, Dr. Feels Black. Given the complexity of our current moment, what does it mean to write about a figure like Harriet Tubman? And then I'm going to ask the same question to you, David, and then to you, Tom.
Ooh, the complexity of the moment calls us to re-examine things that we thought we knew. And one of my goals in Cumbie was to re-examine Harriet Tubman's life, particularly her Civil War service, particularly this moment, which was the least known aspect of her legendary life. I think it calls us to document vigilantly with sources of all kinds. I think it calls us to find and listen to all of the voices. And in writing Cumbie, in studying Harriet Tubman's life during the Civil War, Harriet Tubman was not listened to, right? The Civil War literature ignored her and dismissed her. And so in re-examining her life, I had to get those Civil War historians to give her her flowers.
David?
Well, it's hard in moments of dark times to sort of turn to the past and say, well, you know, this is going to rescue us, because we all have to find our own way. The circumstances are new, the circumstances are different. But one thing I found, just in talking about John Lewis, is that he had almost, by the end of his life, a kind of magical quality, even a holy quality. People wanting to be near him, to listen to him, to touch him. You know, there was one story about John Lewis after the first time Trump had won, November 2016. And a woman, as many of us felt after that surprise, election outcome, she was walking through the Atlanta airport just feeling despair. And she sees John Lewis in the Atlanta airport, where he often was, traveling Atlanta, Washington, and elsewhere. He's over getting a shoe shine. And she walks over to the shoe shine pedestal, and he steps down, and he comes over, and he gives her a hug. And she then tells the story to a reporter and says, at that point, I knew I was going to make it through okay. Now, I don't know that a hug alone is going to save us, but when we look to the heroism of people like John Lewis and Harriet Tubman, Malcolm X, it can provide a sense of perspective, I think, of inspiration, a reminder that times have been worse in the American past, and that through people like John Lewis and their resolve, we were able, in the words of the song that he loved, to overcome. And again, it doesn't provide a blueprint or an easy recipe for what to do today, but it can provide us a reminder that it's possible to overcome.
When I think of Malcolm X, I, especially now looking at the last 2 years of his life after he had left the Nation of Islam, and he often said this, and he said this throughout his life, but you know, he believed in the truth, and we have to get to the truth and uncover the truth. He encouraged everybody, you have to find out the facts for yourself. You can't go by what everybody else is telling you, or else you'll hate the people who love you and love the people who want to harm you. And this is an important lesson even today, because it's so hard to find out what the truth is, where we're vetting our information from. Even the places that we had trusted in the past, they have new ownership with new agendas. We still have to be very vigilant about this, and Malcolm was vigilant.
Right.
And so, in writing this book with my father, it gave us an opportunity to examine how vigilant he was and where this comes from. And what we discovered, it comes from his upbringing with his family. He was a child of Earl and Louise Little, who were organizers for Marcus Garvey. So a lot of the stuff that he learned in his household as a child of organizers, this comes to help him at the end of his life,
right,
and seeking the truth, and also in processing what he's learning when he's traveling around the world, as he's visiting countries and he's understanding what these alignments are about, what the historical country alignments are about, what the wars are about, the importance, the relationship to the resources, and why he talks even more fervently about us fighting for not just simply our civil rights here in America, but our human rights. And so to me, it's just really important to revisit that and re-examine that in this hour, the truth.
These are three iconic figures. They circulate in our imaginations in very interesting and sometimes set ways. Each of you decided to take on this particular figure, not just a biography of that figure, a biography of a historical account of a moment. What was the nature of the work in terms of grappling with A, the archive, and B, the received understanding of the figure, right? So what does it mean, for example, to think about John Lewis as holy and then to tell a story about him in all of his complexity? What does it mean to think about Harriet Tubman as more than someone who conducted the Underground Railroad, who went those many times back to the South? So talk a little bit about what it meant to write about a figure at a moment that a lot of folk think they know.
Yeah, that was one of the biggest challenges of Cumbie. What could I say that was new about Harriet Tubman's life? And I'm not a Tubman biographer, I'm a social historian. And as I dug into the secondary literature and the primary literature, what I discovered is that we really didn't know a lot about what she did during the Civil War. There were things that were repeated, many of which came from her autobiography and interviews she did throughout her life. But it really hadn't penetrated into, say, the Civil War literature. It was really a small portion of her biographies. So I had to set out to find some new sources and discovered that, number one, her work is not recorded in the official military record, which to me was not surprising. I didn't expect it to be there. I wasn't surprised it wasn't there. But that meant that I had to do what I do, which is to find new sources. And Harriet Tubman comes down to Beaufort, South Carolina at a moment. It's after a major battle, which is called the Battle of Port Royal, took place in November of 1861. She arrives in May of 1862. It was at a moment where you had scores of abolitionists, northern abolitionists, who came down to volunteer as teachers, as missionaries, as labor managers. And there were about 8,000 Black people in the area who liberated themselves after this battle, so they're volunteering to help these people. where I was able to find Tubman's life and her work during the Civil War was in the letters of those Northerners. It was in the letters of people whom I track in part 1 of the book. After she liberates herself in 1849, she becomes integral to these abolitionist networks, Massachusetts, Philadelphia, upstate New York. Some of those very same people or their children come down to South Carolina, and they wrote letters home to their families, friends, about Tubman and what she was doing. So no, it's not in the official military record, but it's independent evidence corroborating what Tubman herself said, right? What she said she did during the Civil War, what her nephew, Harkless Bowley, said she did, which he must have learned from his Aunt Harriet. And there are those who need that corroboration.
Indeed. What about you? I mean, John Lewis.
Yeah, I mean, as you say, he was, even by the time I started the book, an icon, and also often called a saint. You know, as early as 1975, Time magazine does a cover story, Saints Among Us. Mother Teresa's on the cover, but John Lewis is one of the handful of people profiled. So he has this reputation, and it's a challenge for a biographer because, as one friend of mine said, you know, when I was starting, you don't want to write the life of St. Francis. I mean, hagiography, which is
Right.
a term we book reviewers use as criticism, literally means the life of the saints. So, you know, as saintly as John Lewis was, as much as he possessed certain tremendously admirable qualities that many of us could never hope to approximate, he was still a human. And I wanted to make sure I showed him, you know, warts and all. He was someone who sometimes disappointed friends, who sometimes made enemies, who sometimes did things he regretted. And it was a real challenge how to write the biography without, you know, bleeding over into a book that doesn't also convey, you know, the great admiration that so many people had for him. But I found that the more I explored the differences he had, the conflicts he had with others, the more interesting he became too. And that as much as we can sort of all feel love and admiration for the John Lewis we remember out there saying, make good trouble, necessary trouble, he's even more interesting, and I think in some ways more admirable, when we see him in all his complexity.
Now, Tamara, I must admit, my goatee is a testimony to my first conversion experience. I grew up Catholic on the coast of Mississippi in Josephite tradition. I make my way to Morehouse freshman year. Person said, you think you're smart, but you don't know who you are. And they gave me the autobiography of Malcolm X. I went into Graves Hall and read it that entire night, and my life was transformed. My goatee is a testimony. I'll never. And then, of course, there's Manning's biography, Manning Marble's biography of Malcolm. So when I read The Dead Are Rise, I came in as this guy who has the hair on his face because of what did it mean for you and your father to tackle a figure who is so important to, say, a person who teaches at Princeton, right? Or to a whole bunch of folk.
Right. Let's just start with my father, Les Payne, who admired Malcolm. He saw Malcolm speak in Hartford, and a lot of what he did in his career as a journalist, organizing. How do you fight for your existence in the newsroom as a black reporter, and the only other handful of black reporters? A lot of this idea is what he learned from Malcolm's and his speeches. When I was young, my father used to, play his speeches, in the household every weekend. So Malcolm was huge in our household, and my father, Les Payne, he didn't want to write a biography. He had a column, and he would write about Malcolm, particularly on his birthday, May 19th. This year, he will be 100 years old. Wow. But when he's a journalist, and that was his passion. So what he wanted to what he was always looking for the story in something. When he had the opportunity to speak with one of Malcolm's brothers, he learned this new information, as I spoke earlier, about Malcolm and his family in childhood and what that household was like. You know, we didn't often associate with Malcolm, even from the autobiography, that his mother was standing over him, telling him, look up words that you don't understand. And this was their daily act in doing homework in their household with the brothers. So when you find out these details, it's like, Malcolm didn't talk about a lot of this in his autobiography. There's more to this story, and people need to know this about him. So my father, you know, he says, he didn't want to do a book, he was really fighting it, but he said this was going to be longer than a magazine piece, and that the people need to know this about Malcolm's life. Malcolm's, the autobiography, I don't know if everybody knows this, but it started off as a piece to support and promote the teachings of the Honorable Elijah Muhammad and the Nation of Islam. And Malcolm always respected that group. Even when he left, he understood the function of that group, but he could not function within it because he had outgrown it, and he outgrown it early. But when he split, that project becomes different. It's now going to be about his life. And so what he wanted to do, he was going to show Black people how you can go from the lowest and become the highest, right? So that's what he's going to apply that to his story now. And so what does that mean? Well, there's exaggerations. And when we came to look at this story, and my father's a journalist, world-class journalist, and what he knows is you have to talk to the people who knew him. So he wanted to find anybody and everybody who knew him. So that became part of my job, to find these people. And we were hearing these stories, and it was getting a fuller picture of who Malcolm was. Mm-hmm. And it became even more important to get his story told in our book. And I'll leave it at that.
So, Dr. Fields, what was the most, the archive for Cumbie is so expansive, as you just kind of let us know. What was the most surprising moment, the shocking moment, right? Or those might be two different things, but a moment that you said, aha, what, Harriet?
I think the most shocking moment, I was in conversation with Civil War historians as I was writing, when I got to a certain stage of writing the book, and I wanted to hear their skepticism before it got published and try to address it. And there were certain sticking points that they had, one of which was the torpedoes. And
talk about the torpedoes.
They didn't believe, Tubman talks about the torpedoes, and she says, we took them up. And her nephew says that Tubman and her men, Tubman was the leader of a group of spies, scouts, and pilots, 8 or 9 men. She commanded these men. She recruited them, she trained them, she commanded them. That Tubman and her men found the enslaved men who were forced to mine the Combahee River with torpedoes, and they took those men back to the site, and they took up the torpedoes, which then opened the river, the Combahee River, up to the Union boats. Colonel James Montgomery, who was the commander of the mission, he commanded the 2nd South Carolina Volunteers, 300 Black troops, and the 3rd Rhode Island Heavy Artillery, 1 battery of white troops. He wrote in his report, his official report, which is not in the official military record, but he wrote in this 1-paragraph report that they took up the torpedoes, right? Still, the Civil War historians with whom I was in contact didn't believe that there were torpedoes on the Combahee. And I was literally in page proofs, and I was going through the final changes, and there was a document that I had to get in there. Got my editor texting me like every day, are you done? And it was a freedom seeker by the name of Francis Izard, who escaped from one of the plantations that was destroyed in the raid. And the minute I saw the name, I searched my database, boom, there he was. I had his son in the database. because the son was a boy when the raid happened. And he talks about the raid later in life. This is the daddy. Daddy escaped before the raid, about a week. He got picked up by the U.S. Army Provost Marshal. And they're writing this report. We got this guy, Francis Izzard. You know, he's brought us this intelligence about what's happening on the Combahee a week before the raid. There are no troops here. They're pickets. They're hungry. If you bring them some food, they might follow you. And then he describes the torpedoes. The torpedoes are made of iron, and they're the size of a pot-bellied stove. So I'm trying to transcribe this document because I want to quote it, and I can't read it. I couldn't read stove. I didn't know what it was. So I was in touch with these Civil War historians. I emailed it to Stephen Weiss, Low Country Civil War expert. Stephen, can you help verify this transcription? He emails it back with a picture of a pot-bellied stove. And he says, we found it. That was the smoking gun that they had been looking for. And I have to say that it was the torpedoes that were the basis of Governor Westmore, governor of Maryland, commissioning Harriet Tubman, Brigadier General of the Maryland National Guard, on Veterans Day 2024. It was the torpedoes. We were working on the Medal of Honor for Harriet Tubman. And right before the inauguration, literally days before the inauguration, the legal opinion came down from the U.S. Army General Counsel that Harriet Tubman was a soldier. And she is to be honored as a soldier in the U.S. Army. I'm getting chills now. Because of the bravery of her acts and the way she risked her life for freedom, for democracy, and for this country, based on the torpedoes.
Wow. Got to get the book, right? Right? David, what was a moment for you where you said, damn, John, what was that moment for you?
Well, there were a lot of surprises because, you know, as well known as the broad outlines of John Lewis's life were, really no one had gone through, you know, closely and looked at the whole life. So the years after he leaves the movement in the 60s and in the 70s and 80s, he's in Atlanta politics, he's in the Carter administration, and then even his whole congressional career really had not been sort of closely studied. Some of the surprises I found were stories about him as a person and his interests and his thinking. For example, I was astonished to learn, and most people still don't know this, he became a phenomenal collector of African-American art. At Fisk University, so he went to American Baptist Theological Seminary in Nashville. But after getting his degree, I think he really wanted to stick around Nashville and make good trouble. He'd stay in the movement. There was a lot of work to be done there. So he enrolls for a second BA at Fisk. He studies with Aaron Douglas, one of the great painters of the Harlem Renaissance. But it's really not until he marries his wife Lillian, who has a deep love of art, that it becomes an abiding interest. And over the years, he gets to know Romare Bearden and Jacob Lawrence. He collects art. He also gets to know all these folk artists, and staff members would describe, you know, driving around these rutted roads in rural Georgia or Alabama, and Lewis, you know, saying, we're going to meet this guy I know, and they'd meet, you know, an older black man who was a painter taking canvases out from under a bed. And, and some of these people have gone on to get recognition, and their work is now in museums and is recognized. And he filled his office, he filled his home with this kind of art. So, you know, for him, African-American art was another way of telling the story. He was particularly fond of figurative art, art that showed black people in ordinary situations, daily, everyday life, but also that told the story. I mean, himself, you know, Jacob Lawrence did The Bridge at Selma. So, and his wife, Lillian, was just hell-bent on getting a copy of that print. A friend of hers had it, and she was demanding that her friend Carol, I want that print, that's my husband. She's like, no, you're not getting it. So Lillian tracked down another copy, got it for John for his birthday. But if you'll indulge me, another kind of revelation I had about John Lewis, which in some ways is more central to the theme of the book. I mean, we know John Lewis as this very principled, committed, fervent freedom fighter, someone who, is willing to put his life on the line in the freedom rides, and again, marching over the bridge at Selma. But there's also a John Lewis who was quite pragmatic and political. So one little surprise, people might be surprised to know, is how enthusiastic he was about the Democratic Leadership Council, which was a group of Democrats that formed in the 80s, sometimes derided as sort of the Southern White Boys Caucus, of people like Sam Nunn and John Breaux. But there were also a lot of black officials in it, like Lewis and Kurt Schmoke, Mayor of Baltimore, Ron Brown, later Commerce Secretary. And John Lewis's argument wasn't that he agreed with people like Sam Nunn on all their politics, but he saw how the Democratic Party had then, as perhaps now, was struggling to win a majority of Americans and struggling to get back to power. And so he saw this as a vehicle, and there were other vehicles too, for building a big tent. And he wanted the Democratic Party to be inclusive, and that meant inclusive, of course, of blacks as well as whites, but also inclusive. He wanted moderates and even conservatives. He didn't want to compromise basic principles. But like in 1988, he wants Sam Nunn to run for president. He didn't share Nunn's politics exactly. Nunn was definitely to his right, but he felt Sam Nunn could probably win. And as John Lewis would say, I like winning. And so seeing that political side of John Lewis and how he struggled and thought about, maintaining his principles, maintaining his core convictions, but still finding a way to navigate in the political world so that you could get the power that you need to make the changes politically that you believe in.
Yeah, when I read that in the book, David, I grabbed a Jameson. It's important that these folk who we see and represent as these heroic figures, that we pull them down to the ground and we see how complex they actually are, that they're not in fact saints, right? That they are human beings with positions that we may agree with or not. Tamara, what about Malcolm? What was that moment? You were the Reese Principal researcher. So much has been written. Was there a moment for you in the archive?
Oh, yeah.
Where you gasped?
There are a few, but I think probably the most dramatic would be meeting with the Klan.
Tell that story about him actually meeting with the Klan.
Malcolm X and Jeremiah Shabazz, they were in Atlanta. Jeremiah Shabazz was the minister of the Nation of Islam's mosque there. And while Malcolm was speaking as a guest minister, they received a telegram from the local Klan chapter saying, hey, we'd like to meet, see what we can do together. And what the Klan had appreciated about the Nation of Islam was, well, they termed it as their segregation, but they called it separation. And basically they were like, well, whatever you want, as long as you're over there. That was their ideology on that. And so Malcolm, who has strong feelings against the Klan, obviously, they've harassed his family from birth. He believes that they were responsible for the death of his father. And so he has this, he doesn't want anything to do with them, friendly or work with them. But when they go back to the Honorable Elijah Muhammad, because they're not the leaders of the Nation of Islam, protocols go to the leader and say, this is what's been proposed, so what should we do? And the Honorable Elijah Muhammad says, we want to do things in the South, so we should meet with them and see let's talk. We may have to work with them. You know, let's find out what they want to talk about. So Malcolm does not feel good about this at all. He wants to tell them off. He wants to fight. He wants to let them know who they are and where they can go. But he has to follow orders, so he does. He gets his jabs in the meeting. We detail this, and to me it was a great find that, as I think it was a matter of the timing when we met with Minister Shabazz, Jeremiah Shabazz, my father and I, he told us the full details of that meeting. It was in his living room. His wife was there serving them iced tea. You know, and we go into great detail of it, so I advise you guys to read the book.
Exactly.
It's a great account. And Malcolm does get a little of his jabs in there in the meeting with the Klan members. But what he comes away from this meeting is that he does not feel good that the Nation of Islam wants to do anything with the Klan and working, whether it's to buy up land, because Klan members, as you know, they're the real estate brokers, they're the bankers, they're the lawyers, they're the sheriffs,
Legislators.
they're everything, you know. And so, and this is what Elijah Muhammad is thinking about. But this is what we find, and this is what was the aha moment for me, was that this is where you really start to see the split happen between Malcolm and the Honorable Elijah Muhammad. It was not about solely that he had impregnated secretaries. It was really, it starts here with the split of the ideology, because Malcolm starts to understand that deals have to be made to do what you want to do, but some deals are not good deals.
Right.
And he starts to understand that what he believed was great about the Nation of Islam, that he didn't think the Honorable Elijah Muhammad believed in those ideas.
Now, you found somebody special in the archives. Talk about that discovery.
I did. I found my great-great-great-grandfather, Hector Fields, whose name we knew, but that's all we knew was his name, and his line of descent, father to son, down to my grandfather. And in the process of researching Cumbie, I learned that he enlisted in the 2nd South Carolina Volunteers in March of 1863, and fought in the Cumbie River Raid.
Isn't that something?
And I did not know this before I started researching Cumbie. I did not know.
That is amazing. So after writing this extraordinary text, what was your summary judgment, not just simply of the raid and, you know, the intervention in terms of the historiography of the Civil War, what was your summary judgment of Harriet Tubman? I know that, for example, when I read the biography, Arnold Rampersad's biography of Ralph Ellison, who was one of my literary heroes, I didn't like him anymore. I didn't like the way he treated his mama, right? Because I'm a mama's boy, right? How did you feel about her at the end of this extraordinary journey?
I think she is a superhero. I think that she is someone who was so divinely gifted that we can't even get our heads around it today. And I think that at that moment in time, Tubman is sort of the epitome of people who were willing to put their own lives, put everything on the line for freedom. And not just their freedom, but the freedom of other people. You know, it boggles my mind that she, after freeing herself in 1849, she went back at least 13 times. 13 times to bring about 70 people out of bondage. It's like putting your hand in the lion's mouth 13 times and not getting bitten. And some of us, you know, because you didn't get bitten, you would go home and be comfortable, right? She could have gone, she could have stayed in Philly. She could have gone and stayed in Canada and then in upstate New York and been comfortable. But no. She then went down to South Carolina, which I like to call the belly of the beast during the Civil War. And not on the Maryland Eastern Shore, not back to her community, which was risky enough, but very close to the area where the first shots of the Civil War were fired, to free and help people adjust to freedom, in quotes. And she said, I couldn't even understand those people. You know, I couldn't understand what they said because of their Gullah Geechee dialect. They laughed when they heard me talk, and I couldn't understand them. No, she didn't know those people. You know, so to put your physical safety on the line for freedom, people you don't even know, so that they could be free. To me, that's the ultimate sacrifice.
So Tamara, just really, we're looking at the time, but I got to get these two questions into the two of you. Now, Manning Marable got into a lot of trouble writing about Malcolm. Talking of, you know, because your biography sits in this conversation between the autobiography, the definitive quote-unquote biography, at least at that time, and then your Pulitzer Prize-winning, National Book Award-winning biography. There were folks who have investments in Malcolm. What were some of the criticisms that you received, or might you have received, for your rendering of Malcolm's life in The Dead or Rising? Because he means so much to so many different people.
He does, and I mean, look, I think that people have their positions and they're entitled to how they feel. You know, I mean, some of the criticism that have come to me was that they feel that we didn't go further on some of the issues. We didn't go far enough, particularly in the international. But a lot of people, I mean, neither did Manning. But my thing is to really understand is we told a story based on the research that we had, and that's what we focused on. And we told the best and truthful story that we found, and that's what we focused on. We weren't really focused on what Manning wrote. Manning Marable wrote. We weren't focused on what other people were writing, because there were other works. But my thing is that we focused on what we had and telling that story and making sure that we could stand by it through our reporting and our research. And that's...
Yeah. So here we are. We've got 5 minutes, and I'm going to come to all of you, and starting with you, David. They told us that the election was about eggs. And we know that that's not true, especially now. We see the scrubbing of the military website at Arlington. We see the assault on the African American Museum, the Smithsonian. We see that in so many ways DEI is a shorthand or the latest iteration of the N-word. In effect, we see an assertion, we hear an assertion that this nation must remain and always be a white nation. Now, you've written on these historic figures. How does your book speak to that effort, that insistence that has been seemingly a part of the country since its founding?
Yeah. Well, look, I mean, this was what John Lewis's life and career, and that of so many friends and colleagues and mentors and proteges, was devoted to refuting. He understood that sort of devaluing of black life, that denial of black equality, was fundamentally at odds with ideals that he understood, following Martin Luther King and others, to be implicit, even though it was never fully realized, in the ideals of American equality. And it's sort of fascinating to see how much John Lewis always strove to understand his quest for racial equality as also a legitimate part of the American story. That, white supremacy and repression, slavery and Jim Crow, that was very much part of what America is and has been. But so too, equally American was the struggle to overcome that, to overthrow that, to contest and refute that. And you see this into, even his final days as a congressman. Some people would say to me, it was kind of common to say on Capitol Hill, well, John Lewis wasn't that much of a legislator. What did he really do as a congressman? Well, he did do some very important things, like the legislation to establish the Smithsonian Museum of African American History and Culture. But I'd say that museum, that was part of a larger project he had, that he used his platform and his power as a congressman, as well as the heroism of his youth in the movement, to continually remind us of the history, of the story of the movement, of Black history. Again, it's what he loved about African American art. So, those graphic memoirs he did, the March trilogy, it was telling the story. Year after year, leading pilgrimages of people, of congressional colleagues over the bridge at Selma, it was retelling the story. His work, every time the Voting Rights Act came up for renewal, he was there to make sure it happened. That was protecting and preserving and promoting the legacy of the movement. So it was work that he saw, that he did his whole life, and that he knew we would have to keep doing after he was gone.
Thank you. Now, we're going to go a little bit over to just a little bit, but I want to get these two to help.
Absolutely.
What do you
Sorry.
speak to this moment, the question?
Our work in Malcolm's life, I think that we look at Malcolm as far as his fight for our struggle and freedom. He was very committed to that. There's also the way he was doing that through finding out the truth and the extent that he would do that through his travels, through his work, through his working with people. He changed as he learned more information, and he adjusted his ability to that. And that is a lesson I think we all can learn from.
Right.
As we get more information, we change with that.
Okay, so I try and to imagine what Harriet Tubman would have said on the morning after the raid. The U.S. gunboats have arrived back in Beaufort, 756 people aboard. These people get off the boat and they parade down Bay Street. They are straight out of the rice fields with whatever they had on. In all of their physical deformities and sickliness, they parade down this street. And people who had been free since November 1861 come out to greet them. They go to the church, and this is where they're trying to recruit the men into the army. Harriet Tubman gives a speech. Of course, there's no transcript, there's no video, so I had to imagine what she said. And I think what she said tells us something that we need to hear today. Freedom is not free. That if one of us is free, we're not free until all of us are free. And we may have to lose what we have or what we think we have so that our brother is free. And we have to build coalitions, right? It wasn't just Harriet Tubman. It was 200,000 U.S. colored troops, right? It was so many other Union soldiers and commanders, particularly of the Black troops. It was the abolitionists in Beaufort who left their homes and went down there, right? Also to the belly of the, so we have to come together. And we may have to build coalitions that we haven't even imagined yet so that we can all be free.
freedom ain't free. Let's go. Thank you very much.